Can you hear me okay back there? Okay, good. I don't know if this thing's on or not. Hey, this is a great turnout. Thank you for coming out tonight. Definitely with weather and COVID, this is really great. I just want to first thank Claudia and the staff and the students who helped with the show. Lindsay, Hannah, I don't know if she's here, Angela, and it's really a big help to get something like this off the ground, and your curiosity and engagement in that process really helped me to kind of keep things on track. A space like the McDonough is really unique, and for me, with my work, I was interested in how could my work relate to the space at the museum. Typically, if you're a student, if you're an artist out there in the world, you might be a painter who makes a painting and puts it into a space, and that's it. I'm kind of curious about how the space in front of painting can be engaged, how you can create a kind of theater to the space, and how painting is both a picture space and it's also kind of a very active social space. You are all in this, in effect, with this show. I'm hoping that you are also kind of walking inside of a painting, not just looking at them. That's my hope. At least that's how I'm thinking about it. So I'm going to try to give some sense of how I go about that thinking, how the space works with the imagery, and how the images work on their own. Does that make sense? I have notes. You'll have to forgive me. I can't remember everything. I was struck by the space. The design of the space is really unique. Just coming down that staircase, you feel like you're kind of going into an Egyptian tomb. I'm not going to have images to show you an Egyptian tomb in this conversation, but you've probably seen one, right? You've seen a pyramid. You probably have seen some kind of show, movie, where somebody goes into a corridor down into the tomb. So it has that kind of descent, the kind of feeling, as if you're going to go see something down in this space that is special, that is hidden, right? It's not on the surface. It's also kind of an interesting space because there's all these floating elements. It's very Japanese, So a weird combination, Egyptian and Japanese. That's how I saw the space. So you have all these in Japanese houses, traditional houses. There's a lot of spaces inside of spaces, and floating areas like this balcony, or like this doorway that instead of, like our Western doorways, there would be two sides of the wall and then there'd be a door. But here's a doorway where the corner is the other edge. So the corner almost disappears. The architect's very conscious of making the corners disappear. And this is a very Japanese kind of sensibility. It makes the space float. So I really love that about the space. Then you have these skylights, and the skylights really elevate the space. So just as you're going down, you suddenly look up. So that kind of shift from gravity to ascension is a really important part of how I think about space. That kind of contrast, okay, between something that's very material, like the concrete, in contrast with something that's very ethereal, like the light. Okay, that's kind of where I approach the space. So that's not necessarily my work, but that's important to the space, and I wanted to engage it. I wanted to react to that. So in my conversations with Claudia early on, that was kind of what we were thinking, that we would try to think about how could you make something that was partly a painting show, but partly also an immersive experience. You would feel like you were in it. So that was kind of important to me. I was going at this is like 2019, if you can remember 2019. We all got together and didn't wear masks. I was going to Japan and on a grant, and I was interested in looking at the difference between a space like Kyoto, which is a very traditional temple-driven city. There's a lot of beautiful gardens and quiet walks and Zen everywhere, which I think we all can appreciate. And the contrasting feeling of Tokyo, which is really heavily tech-driven. You walk into Tokyo and it's just, you get off the plane and it's just lots and lots of neon and advertising, and it's really exciting. If you're, Pokemon, anime, new camera, all of that's in the space. And I was interested in this kind of difference between those two kinds of speeds. So that was kind of my original kind of starting place for thinking about how could I think about that kind of experience in this space. Okay. As I was trying to wrestle with that, a lot of my work is about what we leave behind. Like how what we make is kind of the evidence of who we are. How many of you are artists? How many of you are non-artists? You're not artists. You help support an artist. Okay. So, how many of you have family that work in a factory? Okay. They make something with their hands. Anybody got a family member? I had a bunch of weird uncles who did that. Like they didn't really know how to make something, but they said they knew what they were doing. I really like that kind of humanity. They're in earnest. I'm going to do it, but it's a little off. So when I was thinking about like what we leave behind. That's a big part of what I'm interested in, and so the whole space I was thinking it would be a kind of memory cabinet, or like a series of artifacts. Okay. So you would make associations between things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a couple different ways as I go forward here. My background, I have a liberal arts background. I got an economics degree. I don't know what that's for, but I was interested in like how things relate to each other. Like economics is about supply and demand, and how your needs and her needs intersect. How you have stuff and then you don't have stuff, and the kind of tensions that creates, right? And so I'm always interested in like relationships between things, right? So anthropology is like that, economics, even science is like that. Ecosystems are like different ways parts relate. But I wasn't going to be an economics person. I like to make things, and just can't help but make things. Sort of figure out what can you get away with? What can you get away with? Does that make sense? Not just make it, but like, what can you get away with? I kind of diverged in my life a bit from economics and wanted a little bit more tangible experience. I'd been doing archaeological digs for many years when I was young, when I was high school or in early college. I would spend my summers, even though I was trying to get a degree, as most of you are, I didn't really know what the heck I wanted to do. But I would find myself on these archaeological digs because I really, liked dinosaurs and things like that when I was a 4-year-old. Okay, before it was cool to like dinosaurs. And so that experience of doing archaeological digs you were always aware of what people left behind, right? And you wouldn't have, you go to the museum, you see a beautiful pot, or you see, Tutankhamun's tomb, but most of archaeology is just finding fragments, things that are just, pieces and parts. And there's a difference between seeing a bunch of bones scattered in the dirt and when those bones start to become a hand, and when that hand starts to make a gesture, right? If they're just a bunch of bones, it's bones, but once you do this, it means something, right? Right? It means okay, right? It's not some kind of weird cult thing, right? So that experience of archaeology, you would often see things that weren't even fragments. It wasn't like a pot or some kind of tool. It might have just been a stain, So you would see literally like a stain, like you would see here, and you would be out in the field in Illinois, flat as a pancake, Illinois. And you'd see stains like that, and then you see another stain, you see another stain, another stain. And if those stains were in a line, you knew that it meant something, right? I mean, what would, if you saw a bunch of stains in the earth that were in a line, what would you think that was?
Something tracked something.
So it might be a track, right? Like footprints, right? What if they didn't look like footprints? What if they were just circles, equally spaced? What might that be? Where would that take you? It could be an alien. Yeah, it could be aliens. Yes, I often feel that way when I'm making a painting, like I'm in an alien. But I'm thinking more like post holes, like it was some kind of architecture, and all you had left of the architecture was just the stains. And so that kind of going from nothing to fantasy to some reality, I'm really interested in that kind of shift in meaning. Like you could look at it and then you sort of see it, you make sense of something, and then you see it again and you go, where'd it go? Where'd it go? Did you ever have that experience? I don't know about you, but most of us don't know what the heck's going on half the time, right? And there's moments of clarity, right? And then you go into like whatever you're doing, right? And so those that I'm interested in both of those places. Like when it's clear, that's good, and when it's unclear, that's also really interesting. And I don't know about most of you, but if you're an artist, you're going to be very interested as you go through life about what is unknown. That's like the whole reason to do this. So coming into the space and wondering what it could be is a really important motivator. Not because you know what's going on, but because you don't, right? That's really important. Now in economics or anthropology, you kind of want to figure out what that is. But in art, you don't have to. That's why I'm not an economics person, right? So that's kind of some background. Have any of you been to like the snake mounds in southern Ohio? Really cool. Like right outside your door, you can go do time traveling. You can go back 2,000, 3,000 years in time in southern Ohio. There's all these mounds. There, whole cultures here. And all you have left is this, right? So I think it's really potent stuff to think about time and evidence as a material for making things and for creating an experience for myself and for others that kind of lets you navigate that kind of clarity and questioning, I also worked on a lot of theater stage sets. I worked in the Goodman Theater in Chicago and did some really bad video work. And I learned how to build things. And I learned, like, I wasn't very good at it, but I watched people do it. And one thing that was really exciting to me about a theater was when all you'd have to do is put up something like a sheet, and suddenly you had a theater. Like you're 4 years old and you have a puppet show in your room, right? But it's on stage, and people are coming, and it's a performance, and you're going to enter this world. So for me, that kind of, even though the paintings are very maximal, like there's a lot going on, I was interested in like how could you make the space have a few things to sort of set up a kind of theater, right? All you need is a chair, and we're on, right? All you need is a chair. This chair is the most important chair in this space because everybody's wondering who's going to take it, right? That's really interesting to me. The space between you guys is really interesting to me. You know, you're interesting, right? Yeah, this is great. I can't tell you enough. But that space is really interesting because it carries meaning. So in the work, like the space between things is important to creating a psychology, you know, to create an emotion, right? So maybe I can talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so back to Japan, getting off the boat there, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about like some of the design of the show and why these big scrolls. And when you get off the plane in Japan, you go into these spaces and something like food. Nothing is simple. Something like food, like you want to get some sushi. And what you'll have is a poster of sushi, $5.99, right? And then you'll have a sculpture of sushi, $5.99. And then you'll have a bigger poster that'll say $5.99 sushi, right? And all three things are in this space about this big. And that seems kind of redundant, doesn't it? Like crazy. I mean, but I thought that was really beautiful. Like, how many ways can you kind of catch somebody's attention? And maybe you're more tactile, you know? That's your way in. So any way you respond to space with your senses, you know, your smell, ears, they've got it nailed. Color, bam. Juicy, bam. Right? And that kind of layered experience of when you look at something is very important to my painting. I want it to hit you on a material level, like the material has meaning, like the way it's made is just as important as what it's of, right? That's important. Like, for instance, like in this painting, there's the painting's called Compartments for obvious reasons, but there's the material I'm using is kind of two kind of ideas about material. One is something that feels like a fresco, so something that seems like a wall. Where would you see a fresco if you're in art history? Where would you see frescoes? What country would you go to? Anybody remember the Renaissance? Yeah, Greece. Yeah, somewhere in Europe, probably Italy. You know, Sistine Chapel. And fresco is like painting on plaster. And you might also see it in downtown Cleveland. You know, a memorial or something painted on the side of a wall. But that idea of something being kind of like architecture, I want the paintings to have that presence. And then there's also the opposite of that, something that's a little bit more ephemeral. You'll see a lot of things that look like a spray gun, because that's what it is. So something that seems more like dust or more like a quick spray. So it's less permanent. So those two different kind of thinking about material, something very physical and something that's light and airy. I want that to be happening in the show, so you're kind of navigating that from your senses. Most people understand something that's heavy, right? The heaviest thing in this room is probably this concrete. The lightest is that, And so you almost feel it, right? You feel most of you probably can feel your feet on the concrete, right? So when you're looking at a painting, I think, and you're looking at material in a painting space or a sculptural space, you empathize on that. It doesn't matter whether it's a picture of a duck or this. You're going to feel the weight or the lightness of it, and that's going to tell you a lot about how you want to react to it, right? So I kind of play with that a lot. The scrolls were these kind of the sort of starting place for the show, and they were meant to kind of create these anchors. So from a design point of view, there are these very large horizontal bands, and then these verticals to kind of balance that. The spaces between, say, that scroll and that wall, that negative space, is identical to the space, the dimensions of that opening there. So there's kind of this kind of transfer of dimensions. But the scroll itself is just this excuse to kind of create these compartments and this kind of accumulation of many artifacts in a very large space. So like a stratigraphy, like strata, like looking up different floors in a building, and they're all doing something different, right? The first floor doesn't know the fourth floor, right? That's a very, I think that's a very contemporary experience. That is, you have multiple things in the same space, right? Kind of like the Japanese advertising. How many of you have been on the internet recently, right? You probably have popped up 3 or 4 screens, and they're all getting in the way. It's a very contemporary space where we see many things at once, right? And we don't have any problem with that, right? Or if we do have a problem with that, we're still living in it, right? And I'm interested in making images about our time, right? I'm not interested in making pictures of some other time. I'm interested in this time. And so some kind of space that creates this kind of multiple languages, multiple ways of seeing something, ways of describing something, is part of how the paintings function, right? Some things, like in the painting here, some things are really crusty, some things are very jittery, other things are very clear and static, and it's meant to have that kind of shift, right? Because that's kind of the world that I feel, or I know. But the scrolls, it just presented a really interesting way to create an architecture, because it's very tall. So you're putting an architecture inside of an architecture. So if you notice something like the wall drawing here, there's the corner of the building, that's one frame, and then this wall drawing kind of goes almost right to left, here to here, and then bends here, and then here, and here. So there's another architecture inside of the architecture. That wall drawing has, literally intersects the architecture and mimics the railing. You sort of see the same kind of line in the railing as in the drawing. So they become kind of one. So there's this kind of back and forth between architecture with the scrolls, but I also wanted to think about what was the image in the scrolls. And I'm limited in my studio space. My studio space isn't a grand space like this. It's basically a 20 by 20 garage. It literally is a 20 by 20 garage. Like your two-car garage, everybody knows what that looks like. Like, how do you make that in a two-car garage? Right? How do you make that in a two-car garage? You get the car out of the garage, okay? You make a space. You're all artists, make it yours, right? You make a space for your work, right? For me, it's a little like American in Paris. I don't know if you've ever seen that Gene Kelly movie. He has a very tight apartment in Paris, and he basically gets out of bed. He's a dancer. And he goes over to the chair, and he grabs the chair, and he starts to dance with the chair, right? And then he puts the chair down, and it becomes a table, or he grabs the chandelier and he pulls it down, and it becomes, a table. Or everything is on wheels in his studio apartment. Everything folds into the wall and becomes something else. And that's how my studio is. Everything's on wheels. The front side is a place for tools, and the back side is a wall to put paintings on. Right? So making that in that space, I had a roll, and I'm putting it up here, pulling down a piece, and then painting it, and then rolling it up, painting it, rolling it up, painting it, rolling it up, painting it, and I'm only able to see this much of it, right? And so, for me, that has a really strong kinship with the idea of a memory. That is, you don't necessarily know one moment from the next, and that by the time I'm at the bottom, I'm not aware of the top. Now, I cheat with memory. I have notes. So when I'm constructing these spaces, I'm doing it on the computer and putting together many different fragments on the computer, and I use that as a map, okay? But still, I don't know one section from the next when I'm making it. And so that becomes kind of a game of sorts. I think every artist should have something that kind of they know and something that kind of undermines their own intentions. You do something against the grain of what you want to do. It's kind of like punk rock. It's like that. You love it, but you're also kind of trying to be dangerous. But it's more than that. It's like I'm interested in can you make an image that is very tenuous, that it's like asserting itself and then seems to fall apart as well. So all of the images have this kind of, they seem to assert themselves and they kind of undermine themselves. They fall apart. That's an important thing for me. Most people want it all to be asserted. I'm interested in when it's falling, it's both. There's a lot of artists before me that are interested in that kind of relationship. And, like the surrealist artists, the exquisite corpse. You know that game? You get 4 people in a room, and this is something you guys can do in college. 3 in the morning at a party, pull out a piece of paper, and you fold it into four. I don't know if I can do this. Fold it into 4 pieces, like that. Like that. And she gets to do the head, and then you connect some lines there, and then she gets to do the torso, and then the next person, she gets to do the pelvis, and he gets to do the feet. And you pull it open, and you get this kind of wacky, crazy creature, and you laugh, and you get the picture? Right. In China, you'd have the same piece of paper, but it'd be in a scroll. And so that scroll might be from here to there, right? And you'd roll it up, and you'd tell a story, right, of some, a monk going on his trip through the landscape, and he would have to, have some interaction, maybe some trouble, right? Maybe he would find something. Maybe he would talk to somebody, and that would remember this person. And the scroll would outline that walk through space. And so that to me, as a format for this, was like, okay, that's the beginning of the walk, and that's the end, right? I'm going to have a bunch of walks, and they're all going to be kind of against each other, and then see what that kind of, if you put 3-4 stories together, would you get a more complex idea of being here, right? Your story, your story, your story together. That's kind of how I'm thinking. Let's see. How are we doing on time? Pardon?
You're at 31 minutes.
Oh, that's great. All right. Maybe we could look at a real painting. Yeah. Oh, look at this painting. So, for me, a painting functions at different proximities. Proximity means like how far are you away from it. Like you see something very different than if you turned around and saw the same kind of surface, right? So that idea that I was talking about material, when you're up close, you can tell it feels like gooey or sticky or soft, and that's how you experience it. You don't see the whole when you're in that part. And I think that's just as real, right? I want paintings to function that way. I don't want it to just be a picture of something. I want it to be sensory. I want it to be like sensation, not a picture of a building, but more the sensation of time or change, right? So there may be things that are identifiable. There are, like that is some graffiti. That is a wall with some bricks. That is a vase. Those are those things. But they're also material. They're also, a bunch of stuff squishing together, to become a certain kind of sensation, right? The paintings, like the space, are meant to have different kinds of spatial experiences. You should have places where something flattens out, or something becomes dimensional. So this, really says it's flat, and then it folds, and then it twists. It's kind of like a film, as opposed to a single moment. And that's not new. Picasso's doing that, right? He shows you 5 different ways of depicting something in the same space. The difference is that he's like doing still lifes or a figure, and I'm more interested in space and architecture and sort of stains being the fuel for that, those different ways of experiencing space. So So maybe I can pull out a little bit and sort of how things are made. I go on these walks like I'm in Japan, and I think about the kinds of spaces that is. But I live in Ohio. I'm not really interested in making paintings that depict Japan. I'm just interested in the space that had, the kind of shift in speed. That's what I want to bring into the work, right? That's how I feel when I'm in Ohio, and it just happens that in Japan, there's a lot of people that feel that way, right? So you go, right? You learn something about how that space works. But I live in Ohio. I live with factory buildings that are falling apart. I love ruins, but I don't like them in the sense of romance and Harry Potter and stuff. I like the fact that they're kind of places where something happened, right? I don't really have a romance with them. I'm more just like, that's how things are, right? There's not a romance to it. So I'm not interested in, even though I use ruins and fragments, I'm not interested in that romance. But I like the collecting of things. So I do a lot of walking where I'm going into places and I see things, like something leaned up against something. It was just left there. There's something very personal about that, right? Like a pole leaned up. Somebody took some stuff and left it behind. There's something really exciting to me about that evidence, right? When I was in Japan, there was a very flat space in front of every residence in Kyoto. And it was very flat. There wasn't very much physical space to have a lawn. There's no lawn, right? But they would do the most they could with this very shallow space. And so they would have pots, and their gardens were like this, And sometimes the person was a really bad gardener, right? Like it hadn't been watered, And that was really interesting to sort of see that, just as much as somebody who could really turn it on, right? You all have neighbors, right? You know who takes care of the lawn, right? Same thing in Japan. So that kind of very flat space was important to me, but the things I was going to make it out of were more things from Ohio. That's where I'm from. Or I'm not from here. I'm actually from Illinois, via New England, Chicago. Not really from here, but that's okay. I've lived here for 20 years, so I can own it. But I always feel like it's a place you're going through. You go through Ohio. That's not a bad thing. It's just like how I feel about it. And I want that kind of shift and moving through to be in the work. So when I'm playing with fragments on the computer that are taken from these walks, and I put together some kind of constellation, some kind of theater stage set on the computer, on this little screen, I'm thinking about its potential to be something you can walk through, right? That you can navigate. And that it won't be like the original experience. That's not important. That's just like a starting place. My interpretation of that stain on the earth, that's what's pretty interesting. Like the fact that I get it, that I say, oh, that's a house, or I don't get it. That's that's the alien landing pad. That I think is really exciting, because I think most of us have that experience. Like we thought this was what it was, and it ain't what it was, right? And that's how I want the paintings to function. So these compartments within the painting become kind of different places to either rest or to kind of speed up in that kind of deciphering of a place. Some things are going to be more like straight perspectives that go into nowhere, but that kind of motion might be balanced by some kind of movement the other side. So your eye kind of pulls around and then swipes up, in much the way that wall drawing kind of turns the space, but also turns through space this way, or where you're kind of moving up and then over and through. Yeah. That's how I want the paintings to work, even though it's flat. There's kind of these frames inside, things are sort of in frames, or these compartments. I always want the paintings to, there's these Korean screens. What are those called? Chakri. They're like from the 1700s, I think, and they're like scholar screens. They're like folding screens, and they're made into compartments, and they're pictures of things that the scholar would treasure, like a rock or a bonsai tree or a book. And there's a kind of a kind of preciousness to that, like a care to that, right? And so some of this, the pacing in the show with these smaller works and these compartments, is to kind of create that kind of care to connecting to place. And then other places are more like, screw that, let's move through that, dismiss that, put something in place of it, replace that. Misinformation. You thought it was this, no, it's not that. So places where you can't really name it. So that's a little bit more confusing versus a more, I love you, this makes sense, this is useful, I know what this is. And that happens through the show. So if you're seeing something and you're like, oh, I think that's X, you're probably right, but you're probably wrong too. That's what I hope happens, is that you're sort of clear and then you're not. The frame, I think, is also just this idea of all of this imagery. All of this is temporary. It's going to disappear in 4 weeks, and all of these images are sort of in the space, for you to sort of see. But at the same time, they should present themselves as if they're leaving, as they're forming, that sort of thing. So that's how that's kind of my spiel. What is some? Do you have any thoughts or questions? Anything that I can chat up about?
You mentioned during install there was a specific way you constructed your canvases. How did you do that?
You mean what's behind here?
Yeah, with the jig.
Oh, the jig. Oh, well, that's maybe that's a shop question we can do. Maybe a way of I use a cabinet jig, like you would make cabinets and things that screw together. They're like, everything's like this, and then there's like a screw, and they're like Tinker Toys. And like all of this, there's several panels, and they all fit together in the back. But I like that kind of portability. Like you can put it in the back of a Subaru, you can roll it up, and that kind of flexibility to artwork, I think is kind of interesting. Like those, if you go like, European artists are really smart about this because they have to pay shipping costs. So like everything's like this big, but they're like 5 of them, so they add up into a bigger thing. So you get this big painting, but it all fit into this little container. I like that idea of compartments inside of compartments, like problem solving, So it's visually, you may have a painting that's a puzzle, but the architecture to the show is a puzzle. Like, it's really hard to freaking figure out how to be up on a 20-foot, 20 feet up in the air on this dolly that's what is that thing? Is that the thing that the lift? Yeah, the lift is the size of this, and it's going back and forth, and you got to put a screw in the ceiling upside down, and it's got to be aligned with the floor, so it isn't like this. Yeah, not a good idea, but I like that kind of puzzle, because that's that kind of problem of, like, how do you visualize something up in the ceiling when you're down on the ground to make it right is very much the kind of painting space that I engage in all the time. Right, that's when it's interesting anyway. So you're not quite sure how you're going to get out of this problem. And I think that's a really good thing for you as artists to think about, particularly when you're younger, is try out as many weird, challenging problems as you can. Give yourself some limits, and then try to figure out how you're going to get out of the box, literally, or it doesn't really matter what kind of art you're doing. But it should be a kind of puzzle, and there should be a place where you're like, oh, I didn't know I could take it all apart and put it back together in another, 100 miles away. Like that's a really cool problem, this whole thing was really made I made a model of the whole space, like a 1-to-1 model, 1 inch equals a foot. It was about the size of, about here. And it was like a doll house, and I can move things around in it. And so a lot of even though when you're up there trying to figure that out, in the moment, I'd already figured out where that was going to be in relation to that in a dollhouse. There's a lot of tricks. Roll things up, put them together later. Dollhouse, Japan, wander around, get lost. These are all tricks. These are the ways of feeding your creativity, to create situations that you're not quite sure how you're going to get out of. Yeah.
What was that on these fingers?
Airbrush. Yeah, it's a Yupo paper. It comes in big rolls. There's the translucent, which allows you to sort of see through it. So you get these weird 3D effects. And then there's the opaque, which feels... Yeah, rolling it this way and then rolling it that way. And, it was really DIY. It was really my weird uncle. Like a pole with some duct tape, and then unroll it. You don't get to see that. But imagine somebody really having a bad time of it, trying to spray paint in the dark. Yeah, I don't know anything about spray paint. That's the whole point. There's the Yupo paper doesn't let the paint adhere all the time, and knowing that, there are places in like some of these images where you can see it in here, the white, where the paint is actually peeled away. And that's, again, kind of set up the image and then let it...
So you didn't do that effect on purpose, that just happened?
Did it on purpose is loaded, right? Once you sort of see something happening, you can decide whether you want it to be the way you want to go, right? Right? Sometimes you slip and it was brilliant, right? You decide whether we see it or not, right? It's not the accident. Once you know what something will do, you can actually manipulate that accident, right? So it might appear to be random, and it is, but it's also a controlled accident, like more like an experiment. It isn't just sort of like whatever, But there is a certain amount of that to undermine my own sensibility, I think. They're double-sided. Like some are like this this one and the backside are the same image in reverse, and this and the backside are different. So there are different ideas about memory there. One where the facade of the cathedral is different from the interior of the cathedral. That's what something like that is. Whereas something where it's double-sided and it's the same image is more like that Egyptian tomb, where there might be, you see a big piece of rock and it has a hieroglyph on it, and then as you walk through the door, you turn around and you see the same hieroglyph on the other side of the rock. It's this thick. And the reason they do that in the Egyptian tomb is to make it seem like it's transparent. The mirror becomes transparent. And so when you're on one side of the wall, you're in this life. And when you walk through and look back, you're in the other life. I'm not spiritual, but man, that's pretty powerful. And I'm going to steal the heck out of it. Like, I like that idea about memory and being in two places at once, or being in the same place and having a sense that you're in two different places. I really like that. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question about that.
Right. Well, like some of the works are based off of actual location, and have like these references for them. Did you like any of the actual, like literal aspects of it, like thinking about the history of that building and why it was destroyed, or where it is, or what it originally was, that had the influence on the painting, or like is it more of a imagined history of the creation that you're basing on?
Yeah, I don't think it's literal. Like this, like this is a story about Ohio, or urban renewal, or any of that stuff. I don't have really any. I mean, I understand that stuff. I'm happy to be on a committee to help make the city better and all that, but I'm not interested in making images about that. So I'm not trying to tell that kind of story. But I am really interested in different states of being, like when something's new and when it's not, and when it's renewed. That I think is really potent, and we all feel it, in our bodies, that kind of shift in different states of being. And when we're making something, when we're drawing something, we definitely decide, how do we want to describe that? Do we want to do it fast, slow, lots of information, a few moves? How much do you need to tell that story? So I'm interested in that kind of description more than it being that about Ohio, or that more social narrative, I guess. Does that answer that a little bit? When you're walking, you can't help but notice certain things. How something's piled up. And you're just like, whoa, that's really odd. That was an odd choice. Or something's fallen apart, and you're like, oh my God, how did that pile of stuff get on the floor? It's like you look up at the ceiling and you see a big hole. You're like, oh, that made that. Oh, that is a really interesting space, because it's like about this created that. So the painting becomes kind of about evidence of those kinds of actions, and relationships, right? This sort of something propped against something, like in that painting, or like if you have any of you done like a panoramic camera, like you can't possibly see that, right? But on a computer, you can take a space and you can loop it into itself and insert it into a space that's like straight. Right, so that's what I'm doing on the computer. In terms of like being about that place, I'm interested in not that it's downtown Ohio. I'm interested in, that piece of debris, how it's propped. I'm also interested in like, oh my God, where am I? How did I get here? To quote the Talking Heads. Yeah. Any other questions? You're a good group. That was a lot to hear, wasn't it? I hope that was helpful.